Okay. And a note that this session is being recorded, although not the question and answer period. Welcome everyone to this Jewish law seminar series. Today the talk is sponsored not just by the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies and our Jewish Law, Thought, and Identity program, but also by, in partnership and with the co-sponsorship of the Center for the Study of Law and Society here at Berkeley Law, the Othering and Belonging Institute Disability Studies Cluster of the university, the Disability Studies Minor, and Berkeley's Center for Jewish Studies. And it's a real honor today to have Sam Levine, who is really one of the really important leaders, not just in writing and researching about Jewish law, but integrating Jewish law into the law school curriculum, both at Touro Law Center, where he's professor of law and director of the Jewish Law Institute, but also thinking about what it means to bring Jewish law across the board into the legal curriculum of the United States. He's published 2 books, more than 50 law review articles and book chapters, and he teaches widely on legal ethics, on Jewish law, on criminal law, and constitutional law. And Sam, what an honor it is to have you here today. And as we were saying before, I really look forward to next time having you in person so you can greet everyone personally. And thanks to the partnership of Steve Rosenbaum, who's the Frank Newman Lecturer at Berkeley Law and visiting research scholar in disability studies at the university's Othering and Belonging interest. And he works widely on research, but also on advocacy, including disability discrimination, dignity, and self-determination in education. And we're so glad that he was not only a key player and driver in the vision and conceptualization of today's program, but also will be in dialogue with Sam. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Steve, and thank you.
I think we're turning it over to Sam at this point. Right?
Oh, are you? Okay, great.
But yeah,
okay.
Thank you for the introduction, Ken. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you,
so we'll
Steve.
turn it over to Sam.
And thank you so much, Ken. And the honor, of course, is mine. Berkeley is such a leader in all of the areas that I draw from in this book, and more generally in my scholarship and my teaching. Berkeley's renowned for your center in Jewish law and Jewish studies, disability rights, inclusion, belonging, which is a word and a concept that I think is terrific in this context, law and society. And I think all of these different disciplines do go into some of the scholarship that I've drawn upon, some of the ideas that I've drawn upon in this book, and again, more generally in my other areas of teaching and scholarship. And it's such a pleasure as well as an honor to be able to interact with all of you on this topic, given the variety of interests that you all have and the different disciplines that go into this discussion. And I want to particularly thank Ken and Steve and Rebecca and Jonathan and Maya and all of the organizers really for your perseverance. I think Ken kind of alluded to this in his opening remarks. This event was scheduled to take place in mid to late March. And of course, it was, I don't know, maybe the first week of March where we realized it just wasn't going to happen. And I've been on the other end of organizing or rescheduling events that were set to take place last year in March or earlier in the year in March and April. And I know Rebecca put in a lot of work, Steve as well, and all of the organizers in finally having the opportunity to interact with you, not in person. And I'm looking forward to that time as well, Ken and Steve. We were going to go to lunch, so that didn't work out either. Maybe we'll have a virtual dinner afterwards. And you were talking about a drink, so that'll have to be virtual as well. for now, but I look forward to the opportunity to join you all in Berkeley. I want to talk just a bit about what I was looking to do in writing this book, briefly describe my thesis and some of the evidence I suggest for my thesis that Joseph was potentially on the spectrum, and more precisely, that the portrait of Joseph that emerges from the biblical text, from the Midrashim, from a close look at the biblical commentators for thousands of years, spanning geographical areas around the world, paint a portrait consistent with that of our contemporary understanding of an individual who is on the autism spectrum. And my goal initially in researching and writing this book was not, although I am very much a proponent and advocate of disability rights, inclusion, again, belonging, which I think is a terrific term in this context and a terrific concept in this context. My goal was not so much, although I'm pleased if this book can contribute toward those efforts. My goal was primarily not to be a disability advocate, disability rights advocate, which again I am in other areas, but more to understand the story of Joseph, because the biblical story of Joseph is a mysterious, puzzling story for us to understand when we look through the arc of the story, starting from the beginning, starting from Joseph as a youth who has these difficulties with his brothers, with his father, who has these dreams, who has these visions, who clearly has certain talents and abilities, but at the same time, certain deficits and weaknesses. And then as we continue, Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers. He emerges in Egypt, where he attains remarkable success through the supports of Pharaoh, of all people. Not out of the goodness of Pharaoh's heart, as far as I can tell, but certainly out of his own self-interest in recognizing Joseph's talents and skills that he can provide for the Egyptian empire. And ultimately, Joseph essentially saves the world. He envisions a plan and implements this plan, whereby he interprets Pharaoh's dreams, interprets what's going to happen, and devises and implements the plan, the agricultural plan, whereby both Egypt and the surrounding lands are able to succeed the ensuing famine. Ultimately, Joseph is reconciled with his long-estranged brothers, with his father, and in many ways, there's a potentially happy ending to the story. So how can we put all of these pieces together, these skills and talents and remarkable abilities Joseph has on the one hand, and the clear deficits, weaknesses, challenges he has on the other hand? So I had my aha moment, as it were, when my older children, were a bit younger. And this was a time where I think it's fair to say, certainly for myself, and I think within, I'd say, American society, there was a growing recognition of the reality of autism, a growing acceptance of the prevalence of autism, far beyond what I think we as a society had recognized previously. And one day I was watching some kids, including my children, in the playground, and there was this one kid who kept approaching the other kids. You could tell this child was being marginalized, isolated, ostracized, and he kept coming back to the popular group, to the other kids. And he would do something to get their attention. He would do something that seemed awkward, off-putting, and they would react in the unfortunately expected way of kids who showed no understanding of what he was doing. But at the same time, he didn't understand what they were doing. He kept coming back. And I was wondering, why does he keep coming back? Why does he keep engaging in the same behaviors? Doesn't he get it? And I think the answer in that case, and this led me to look at the story of Joseph in a different way, was that no, he didn't get it. There was something about the way this child thought, the way this child processed reality, the way this child socially interacted with others, that he actually didn't understand, or for some related reason, kept returning, notwithstanding or maybe because of the stimulus that he was getting from that form of interaction. And as I continued to learn about autism and research autism and speak with both scholars, practitioners, and I think most importantly, individuals themselves who are diagnosed or perhaps self-diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum, I had that aha moment regarding Joseph, because I had studied, certainly read, and studied in a fair amount of detail the story of Joseph from the time I was young. And I had seen plays of Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. I think I had seen at that time the DreamWorks animated story of Joseph. I might have read a bit of some of the novelizations of Joseph's story, and I studied the biblical text in great detail. And I was always puzzled, as I imagine most readers are, by Joseph's returning to his brothers. He's already been marginalized. He's been isolated. They don't like him. He has this dream where it's a thinly veiled, very thinly veiled metaphor of him ruling over them ultimately. And he's compelled to tell them that dream. And again, the expected unfortunate response, which was he prompted their extreme resentment of him. Are you going to rule over us? Are you going to be the king? And what does he do? He dreams again and he goes back again. And it just echoed my puzzlement of that child on the playground. Don't you get it? Why are you going back again? And when we read the story, we just wonder, come on, Joseph, don't you get it? Why are you going to them again? They just told you they can't stand you. They just told you they don't want to hear it. So I saw a potential parallel between Joseph's behaviors in that particular instance and behaviors that are common among individuals on the spectrum. Now, at some point, I kind of left it at that because I thought, okay, it's an interesting observation. Perhaps it's what we might call, a Devar Torah, where you would say, in synagogue, in shul, you might tell a story and say, wow, this is a really interesting suggestion that maybe there's some correlation, and you kind of go home and maybe think about it and leave it at that as well. But I decided, and just to be more accurate, it wasn't as much I decided here too. I didn't have the goal of proving or demonstrating or bringing out the biblical text and the midrashim and the commentators and showing aha as well. In all these other instances, Joseph's portrait does resemble in many ways individuals on the spectrum. Instead, as I continued to read through the story and continued to study the story, one episode after another kind of jumped out at me as well. And as time went on, the portrait emerged to the point where I said, this is more than a Devar Torah, this is more than a one-off. This might be, and it turned out, in my opinion, to be significantly substantial in the makings of a broader project, which turned into a book as a whole. So we don't have time to go into all of my examples. And again, it's a long story. It's several chapters, several Torah portions at the end of Bereshit, at the end of the book of Genesis. Several weeks, several Shabbatot that we read one section after another where Joseph is one of, if not the central character. And again, in my reading, I think it's fair to say that in some ways, one episode after another fits this pattern of Joseph resembling, evidencing, manifesting characteristics and behaviors of an individual, or consistent again within those of an individual on the spectrum. So of course we don't have the time to go into all of the examples, so I thought I'd give just a few of the examples that were particularly meaningful to me as I went through this story. And a couple of quick caveats. As you may have seen, the title of my book is posed in question form. Was Yosef, using the Hebrew, on the spectrum? And the question is, of course, intentional. None of us was there. This is not intended, the study is not intended as a diagnosis, but as a more nuanced reading of, let's say, a historical character that we actually end up knowing a lot about, or at least a fair amount about based on the biblical text, and a lot about if we take seriously, not literally necessarily, but take seriously the understandings and the portrait that the Midrashim are getting at, that the teachings, that the lessons that are intended in the different commentators and the different commentaries, again, that were presented over thousands of years throughout different areas of the world. The other caveat, if you haven't heard this phrase before, I think it's a very helpful understanding of autism, which is if you've met one individual on the spectrum, you've met one individual on the spectrum, which of course demonstrates that, as the term suggests, the autism spectrum is indeed a wide spectrum, and every individual on the spectrum is different, just like every individual who's not on the spectrum is different. In Joseph's case, and I don't want to read too much from my book, but I do want to read what I consider to be the significant, the specific characteristics, you might call symptoms, behaviors that Joseph evidences that are, again, consistent with individuals on the spectrum. So I list this on page 10 of the book, if you have it. Social challenges punctuated by an inability to read social cues, understand and anticipate the feelings and reactions of others, and navigate social settings. And of course, Joseph not recognizing that going back to his brothers, initially going to his brothers and insisting on telling them about his dreams, and then returning again and insisting that they listen once again to his dreams, very much demonstrates his social challenges, his inability to read their social cues, to anticipate how his actions and words will affect others, in attachment to animals or to inanimate objects in place of interpersonal relationships. Significantly, in the very opening verse, the text tells us that Joseph is a shepherd with his brothers, and several commentators make the point that what the text of the Torah is presenting here is a portrait of someone who's particularly good at shepherding, which may explain, this goes a bit on in the story, when Jacob, Joseph's father, who has great difficulty navigating and managing this rivalry, these disputes, or more than disputes, between his sons, Jacob at one point actually sends Joseph off to see how his brothers are doing with the sheep, which is in itself quite puzzling. To me, that demonstrates, A, some of the challenges that parents and adults in particular have in recognizing autism, in recognizing the characteristics and challenges that come with autism, and in particular, recognizing the dynamics of the peer relationship between an individual with autism or an individual with other disabilities and the marginalization that they face on the part of their peers, that again, sometimes parents or adults are not quite attuned to what's going on there. Well, in part, I think, Jacob sends Joseph to his brothers to see how they're doing in the shepherding, and that's the language the text uses, because Jacob recognized that Joseph's really good at shepherding. He has a way with animals. We know, for example, Temple Grandin, probably the most famous person in the world on the autism spectrum, has invented inventions connected to animals. And she's spoken publicly, and there's movies about her as well, about her connection to animals and her comfort with animals. And it's not just Temple Grandin, it's not just these extreme cases, it's quite common, again, for individuals, children on the spectrum, to have a sense of comfort, to have a degree of familiarity with animals, in a sense more so than they do in interpersonal relationships. So Jacob's goal, I think, was actually well intended. Let's find Joseph, something for Joseph to excel at. Let's find an area where Joseph has talent. Let's send him to his brothers to see how they're doing. So Joseph's talent with animals, A, in my reading, reinforces a portrait of an individual, a child on the spectrum. At the same time, it demonstrates to us some of the difficulties and mistakes that adults often make in trying modes of inclusion with children on the spectrum, and again, with other disabilities as well. So for example, if we contemporize some of these events, let's say there's a child on the spectrum, and again, we do use generalizations, which, just to emphasize, if you see one person on the spectrum, it's one person. As a generalization, many researchers have identified, consistent with autism, a particular talent when it comes to mathematics, when it comes to sciences. Let's say you have a situation where there's a kid in school, it's on the spectrum, really good at math. And that kid, unfortunately, happens to be all too often, tragically, is marginalized, isolated by their peers for all kinds of reasons. And the teacher's thinking, okay, how do I include this child? I know there's another kid who's struggling with math. I'm going to put them together. Why don't the two of you go outside? And the unpopular kid, the kid that's on the spectrum, you're really good at math. Why don't you help out that other kid? Well, what's going to happen? I think we have a feeling of why that may not be the best idea. And in a sense, I think that might have been what happened when Jacob sent Joseph to his brothers to see how they're doing. And again, the commentators suggest that Jacob was looking for Joseph to check on them. And if they are wrong in the way, if they're making mistakes in the way that they're tending to the sheep, he should correct them. Well, again, there are ways of inclusion, there are modes of inclusion, and that was probably not the best strategy. And of course, not surprisingly, the result was the result that we would expect, or might unfortunately expect. If we send the two kids out together and say, okay, you help him, well, that might be what happened here, where the brothers, not surprising, but disappointing response is, I can't believe he's approaching us again. We have to get rid of him. And of course, ultimately, they do sell him into slavery, and Joseph goes into Egypt. Other indications that Joseph may be on the spectrum. Another very common characteristic of individuals on the spectrum, heightened intellectual capacity and creativity in narrow areas of interest. So Joseph has his dreams. Joseph's able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. There's something about, and of course, the butler, the Sar Hamashkim, has these dreams when Joseph's in prison with Pharaoh's formerly very high assistants. Joseph just has a way with his own dreams and with interpreting the dreams of others in a way that no one else can even believe. He has a narrow talent. He has great difficulty when it comes to interpersonal relationships. He has great difficulty when it comes to his social environment. He has great difficulty, and again, in the interest of time, without going verse by verse, I suggest looking through the story again from the very beginning, throughout Joseph's interactions with others in Egypt, where he continues to exhibit social challenges. He often says the wrong thing, even when he's exhibiting brilliance. Even when he interprets Pharaoh's dreams in a way that no one can believe. Pharaoh is amazed, the Egyptian assistants are amazed, that they're upset, they're kind of jealous, it so seems, of Joseph's success, but they acknowledge it. They have no choice but to realize that this is someone who has a particular talent, a particular capacity to interpret the dreams in a way that no one else was able to do so. This is looking ahead to Pharaoh's dreams. But at the same time, if we look at the verses very carefully, Joseph, time after time, says the wrong thing, doesn't realize how others are looking at him. There's the episode with the wife of Potiphar, where Joseph is true to his morality, true to his commitments, as Midrash suggests, true to his father's lessons to him, withstanding the temptations, the advances of the wife of Potiphar, but he says the wrong thing to heart. He doesn't anticipate, and if you look at the story, if you look carefully at the text, and again, the Midrashim and the commentators, there emerges this portrait of Joseph being nearly oblivious to a danger that we all see, not just because we know the end of the story, but as we're reading the story, we can anticipate what's going to happen next, and he doesn't. He's true to morality as he sees it. He's true to justice as he sees it, but he goes about demonstrating his morality, his truth, speaking truth to power often, in a way that's problematic to him, that ends up being to his own detriment, that ends up often being self-incriminatory even when he's telling the truth. So Joseph once again exhibits both these talents, these remarkable successes, and at the same time, he often exhibits deficits, difficulties that result in great problems for him immediately as well as down the road. Another example of Joseph's commitment to truth and the ways it kind of gets him in trouble. And again, in a very puzzling manner, early on in the story, again, in the very first verse, we're told that he brings bad reports, so to speak, of his brother's conduct to his father. So in a fascinating way, I think, the commentators wonder, what exactly were they doing wrong that Joseph was reporting about? And why was Joseph reporting on his brothers? So in an interesting way, some of the commentators are reluctant to attribute really bad actions to Joseph's brothers. So they suggest that some of the conduct that Joseph was referring to was that he reported on to his father, was conduct that technically might have been permissible, as a technical matter, might have been legal in a very nuanced way. They might have found a loophole in the laws, various laws regarding kashrut, regarding other matters. But to Joseph, because he was so righteous, it suggested, he didn't see it that way. He had to go tell his father they're doing something wrong. To me, this very much resembles what's sometimes called kind of a black and white sense of morality. Not looking at the nuance, but looking at, come on, this is the wrong thing. And I'm not going to accept those excuses. And individuals on the spectrum often do have this tendency, do have this sense of this is right and this is wrong. And rather than accepting the excuses, as it were, the technicalities, the loopholes that Joseph's brothers might have been able to find, Joseph looked at the world in a different way and brought those reports to his father. Now, why was he going to his father? Didn't he get it here too? Joseph may not have quite understood, and in many ways it seemed that he was oblivious. And here too, the commentators talk about Joseph being pure, in a sense. The commentators talk about Joseph having this honesty, Joseph being so righteous that he felt that he had to tell his father about what his brothers did. Well, this is once again very consistent with the sense that many individuals on the spectrum have, where they're not going to finesse necessarily the reality. They're going to tell it as it is, again, in a way that's undoubtedly true to themselves, often true to the reality that they're seeing, but in a way that the listener is going to take differently from the way it was intended, and in a way, in this case, for example, that's only going to breed more trouble for Joseph, because the last thing he needs is for his brothers to see him tattling on him to his father, even though, again, it was the truth, even though he felt compelled to bring this truth to their attention. And that fits with what I describe again in this list of characteristics: an obsessive and compulsive focus on a private way of perceiving the world, and a rigid and literal perspective on truth, ethics, and morality that sees virtue in extreme terms rather than in allowing for nuance. Now, just another couple of examples. And again, these examples are found early on in the story. Joseph's 17 years old. Again, the opening verse in the story tells us Joseph is 17 years old, and he's described as a na'ar, is a Hebrew word, typically translated as a lad, a small child. And the Midrashim make the point. He's 17. He's not a small child. Famously, Rashi, one of the most famous commentators on the Torah, tells us, well, Joseph's described as a child because he's engaging in childish activities. What type of childish or childlike activities? Well, Rashi says he was tending to his eyes, to his hair. And Rashi says, well, that was because Joseph was trying to make himself appear nice. Joseph was interested in looking good, and that's kind of childish. So I'm not sure, looking good is more childish, than than adult-like. And B, interestingly, I looked at the midrash that Rashi cites from, and at least one version of the midrash does not talk about Joseph engaging in these activities for any purpose of looking good, for his own appearances. It simply states that Joseph tended to his eyes, to his hair, and then the third activity that Rashi doesn't cite is he kind of kicked his heels in a way. So as I read this midrash, it suggested to me that this was potentially Joseph engaging in what we call forms of self-stimulatory activities, very common to individuals, children in particular, on the spectrum. And for a 17-year-old to be engaging in these types of activities, playing with his eyes, kind of curling his hair, kicking his heels, maybe a form of toe walking, for those who are familiar with that, maybe that's what was going on. And maybe that's the reason that the text tells us Joseph was a na'ar with his brothers, because his brothers saw this 17-year-old engaging in childish or childlike activities, which is very off-putting to them because they didn't understand why he was acting this way. Now, the very same text tells us that Joseph was a ben zikunim to his father Jacob. Ben zikunim has a lot of different interpretations. One of the very common interpretations is he was very wise. He's ben zikunim, literally meaning a child of old age, which some interpret to mean that he was a child born to Jacob when Jacob was older. But others point out that many of the other children were born when Jacob was older too. In particular, Benjamin, who was even younger than Joseph. So what does ben zikunim mean? So many interpreters suggest ben zikunim means Joseph was wise beyond his years. So some commentators pose the question, wait a second. You just told me he was a na'ar, he was a child, he was childish, childlike. Now you're saying he's wise like an adult. Isn't that contradictory? And it occurred to me, you know what? There's no contradiction if we're looking at an individual on the spectrum. Because the text specifically says that Joseph was a na'ar with his peers. He acted, his behaviors were childish toward his peers, but he was a ben zikunim to his father. He was wise beyond his years in his father's eyes. And these are very different characteristics. A child on the spectrum, it's not uncommon, again, without overgeneralizing, for a child on the spectrum to be wise beyond their years in certain way, intellectually, and it's particularly the case that adults are likely to accept and to appreciate their talents, that wisdom. Their peers, it's much more likely. Their peers are more likely to simply resent them because of their behaviors that they don't understand and they don't want to understand. And here too, Joseph's brothers marginalize, isolate, ultimately cast him out, where his father tries to appreciate him, tries to build him up, tries to include him, although again, I suggest that this method of inclusion was ill-fated from the outset. Just to close with another model of inclusion, or belonging. And of all things, this is the episode where Joseph meets Pharaoh. And this episode occurs after Joseph's sold into slavery in Egypt, after Joseph has the tumultuous events surrounding Potiphar's wife, after Joseph is placed in prison with the butler and the baker, after Joseph correctly, precisely interprets their dreams, predicts what's going to happen to them. But, and again, without getting into the text, you can look for the evidence that I think I find for this, as I describe in my book. Joseph brilliantly interprets their dreams in a way that's at the same time socially inept and off-putting. So, yeah, the quick version of this, the butler is released from prison as Joseph predicts. Pharaoh has these dreams, doesn't know what to do. No one can interpret them. The butler's like, there was someone back with me in prison, and the butler is quite reluctant. It's remarkable as you read through the story why he was so reluctant. In my reading, it's because he recognized Joseph's off-putting social behaviors, and he's nervous. If I recommend him to Pharaoh and he says something wrong, what happens to me? Well, he has no choice. He recommends Joseph. Joseph interacts with Pharaoh. Again, it's a very nuanced reading of the biblical text and the commentators, but I think it's fair to say that Joseph engages in awkward, socially inappropriate behavior, conversation, modes of interacting with the king of Egypt, but he gets it right. But he interprets the dreams brilliantly. And here's where Pharaoh's response is remarkable. Pharaoh sees this. Pharaoh gets it. He understands the warning that the butler had, again, kind of very thinly veiled, in a very thinly veiled way, had said to him that this person I'm going to recommend to you, just make sure you're ready for their behaviors. Pharaoh sees what's going on, but this is Pharaoh. He's so self-centered, so self-interested, so driven to remain in power that he thinks to himself, well, what do I do with this person? They're brilliant, but I'm concerned about their social environment and their social interactions. So here's what Pharaoh does. Pharaoh gives Joseph a new name. Pharaoh gives Joseph a wife who's said to be of royalty. So we don't have any repetition of the nearly catastrophic episode with Potiphar's wife. Pharaoh gives Joseph nice clothes. Pharaoh walks Joseph, introduces Joseph to his kingdom so that Joseph can then succeed on his own. And I see that as a model of inclusion that's more successful. I see that as a model of inclusion that recognizes for an individual on the spectrum, and more generally for individuals who have disabilities, whatever they may be, a model of inclusion that recognizes both their talents and their deficits, both their potential successes and their challenges, and provides the necessary supports, structures, environment to try to minimize as much as possible some of those challenges, to try to preempt, head off some of those potential challenges, and instead gives them the opportunity, where available, to thrive, to succeed. And in Joseph's case, he's able ultimately to save the world. And at the very end of the story, just to close, with Joseph's successful reconciliation with his brothers. And this is not easy by any means. And the story itself, once again, is quite mysterious, quite puzzling, and time does not permit an entire analysis of the entire ending of the story. But just to close with maybe a happy ending, which is Joseph's brothers, to the last moment, are not sure, is he going to take revenge on us? Is he going to resent and harbor that resentment of what we've done to him? And the very end of the story, with the close of the book of Genesis, the very end of Sefer Bereshit, has Joseph telling his brothers that they need not worry, that this was God's plan for him and for them, and Joseph speaks to their heart. And I see that as, again, a happy ending, at least a measure of optimism for individuals on the spectrum, for their families, for those who interact with him, where as a result of, whether it's Pharaoh's, what I see as successful method of inclusion, whether it's Joseph just having this opportunity to thrive, whether it's Joseph maturing, whether it's Joseph's brothers maturing and beginning to accept him, there is this sense of reconciliation at the very end of the story. Thank you.
Thanks so much for giving us a wonderful taste of your book. Now let me turn over to Stephen and invite him to share some comments.
Thank you. And thank you again, Sam, for producing this creative work. The blurb on the back cover of Sam Levine's book begins with the words, Joseph's behaviors. I had never heard of behaviors in plural until I became the father of a son with significant disabilities. And the fact that Professor Levine treats on the spectrum as a household term says something about the level of contemporary disability consciousness, or at least about the public's familiarity with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, which has catapulted autism into our social discourse. And reading his book launched for me a broader inquiry about Judaism and intellectual disability, and about disability more broadly. Now, looking to the Hebrew Bible or post-biblical writings will not really tell us what Judaism has to say about autism, but we can find Jewish teaching more broadly about disability, everywhere from the Torah to resolutions adopted by the Central Conference of American Rabbis. And in the story of Yosef, there are also comparisons to be made about contemporary understandings of autism. A few themes stand out in Sam's chronicles of Joseph that draw the reader to reflect on this autistic young man's personal, familial, social, and community relationships, which I will touch on in a bit, including the marginalization and fraternal relations that Sam alluded to. A cardinal principle in disability discourse is that no two people with the same disability will behave alike, and Sam made this very clear at the outset. Much less will they prefer the same label for their disability, if any label at all. Everyone's autism is different, is how one leader described it to anthropologist Helen Thomas. Disability identity labels have evolved over time, sometimes engendering great debate about proper and nuanced naming. For example, reasonable and even unreasonable people disagree about whether disabled person is acceptable in lieu of a people first term like persons with a disability that accentuates the humanity rather than the impairment or disabling condition. Now, some CRIP activists and academics actually choose disability first or identity first language as an act of reclaiming, defiance, or pride. We've seen that in terms of queer, for instance. The founder of the Autism Network International, Jim Sinclair, put it this way many years ago: saying person with autism suggests that autism can be separated from the person. I can be separated from things that are not a part of me, and I'm the same person, a person with a purple shirt one day and a person with a yellow shirt the next. But autism is part of me, he says, hardwired into the way my brain works. I am autistic because I cannot be separated from how my brain works. The spectrum has evolved from what anthropologists Helen Thomas and Tom Bolstroff call an outsider concept developed for diagnosis and classification to an insider term of selfhood, as well as the basis for group identification and disidentification, end quote. Now, perhaps Sam's greatest contribution to the literature is in portraying an individual with a so-called invisible disability in normalized circumstances. Now, the one basic norm and supreme value in Jewish law is the command of God as embodied in the Torah. And in his comparative study between Jewish and American law that came out a couple of years ago, Professor Levine informs us that the commandments of the Torah, like the US Constitution, are subject to broad interpretation. Nachmanides is among the legal authorities who understand the biblical command to be holy, live righteously, to be a general mandate for unenumerated obligations and prohibitions. Now, arguably, this holiness would include the obligation to treat others equally, without regard to disability, with a mandate against disability-based discrimination. Now, notwithstanding this comprehensive and virtuous command, the Hebrew Bible is fraught with conflicting views of disability and the disabled body. Of course, that's not unique to find these kinds of conflicts in the text of the Bible. On the one hand, Jews are instructed in Leviticus to, quote, not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. Yet 2 chapters later, God issues a blistering manifesto of ableist insults and obstacles, telling Moses to forewarn his brother Aaron and all Israelites, quote, no one who has a blemish shall draw near, a man blind or lame, or one who has a mutilated face or a limb too long, a man who has an injured foot or an injured hand, a hunchback or a dwarf, or a man with a defect in his sight, an itching disease or scabs, or crushed testicles. No man of the descendants of Aaron the priest who has a blemish shall come near to the veil or approach the altar because he has a blemish, that he may not profane my sanctuaries, for I am the Lord who sanctify them. Whoa. Now that catalog of disfavored includes those who are blind or lame and those who have defective sight, the very individuals who in a previous chapter were advised to neither insult nor obstruct. Now, in his explanation, one modern Orthodox rabbi strained to distinguish between the roles of cantor and those who serve on the bima, the altar. Whereas imperfection, read disabled, is acceptable for the liturgical leader, he explains, the temple clergy must be perfect. Now, my rejection of this literal interpretation is not informed by observant practice, to which I defer to Sam, as well as the scholarship, nor does it informed by an affiliation with a non-Orthodox sect of Judaism. I do identify as a Jew for whom the, quote, draw of law for members of an excluded and discriminated upon group is its commitment to justice and equality. I attribute to Professor Eli Wald. I disagree with the notions of perfect and broken and the parsing that it requires in order to reconcile the textual conflict in Leviticus. Instead, I subscribe to the interpretation that preserving human dignity is of such importance that it overrides any negative commandment found in the Torah. And this would also be in keeping with the place that dignity holds as a key principle in secular disability rights and justice discourse. There's a few intellectual disability or autism themes that stand out in Sam's Chronicles of Yosef. He's talked about some of them today, that draw the reader to reflect on this autistic young man's social and community inclusivity, his relations with his brothers, and his sexuality. Now, as to inclusivity, in the book of Genesis, Yosef is seen transitioning from childhood to adulthood. The contemporary independent living movement is defined by legal concepts such as a most integrated setting, full inclusion, least restrictive environment. That is, individuals like Yosef ought to be living their lives in the most inclusive or integrated settings feasible, whether in the public square, at home or school, with family, in vocational training, the workplace, or even, as in Joseph's case, jail. Belonging. It's about belonging. In the book of Isaiah, God delivers this invitation to inclusiveness. Quote, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." And in the Mishnah, Rabbi Hillel said, "Do not separate yourself from the community." Theologians and biblical scholars may debate the weight that's accorded to such exegetical sources as resolutions adopted by Jewish Reformed clergy, but these too are expressions of Jewish teaching. And at its biennial a few years ago, for example, the governing body of the Union for Reform Judaism adopted a resolution that commits to, quote, "enabling and encouraging people with disabilities and their families to participate fully in Jewish life." The resolution also encourages its institutions and affiliates to adopt person-first language, giving child with autism rather than autistic child as an example. Well, there you see already the debate in naming. But again, the notions of inclusivity and interdependence are consistent with secular understanding and discourse about disability. Now, Sam told us today, as he does in more length in the book, about a 17-year-old Yosef, described in Genesis as a na'ar, term usually reserved for a young child. There is a tendency to infantilize or objectify persons with disabilities, regardless of age or type of disability. Sam refers to the self-stimming satisfaction, the social difficulties, the need for adult attention, which are typical or stereotypical of autism characteristics. In a recent study, parents of young adults with autism or intellectual disability were asked to assess their children's quality of life. The lowest rated domain was social or peer support. And almost 1/3 reported that their son or daughter never or rarely had fun with friends, and fewer than 1/2 indicated the children were never or rarely able to rely on friends. Sam contrasts the approach of Yosef's father Yaakov with Pharaoh's approach. Perhaps well-meaning people attempt to mask differences or engage in contrived integration, but the better approach, as Sam refers to, is to facilitate genuine contact with and participation by persons with autism or other disabilities. In any event, I agree with the suggestion that Pharaoh has adopted the preferred approach to integration. Yet in Genesis, when speaking of Joseph, Pharaoh asks, quote, "Can we find like this a man who has the Spirit of God in him?" It's not clear to what extent Pharaoh was truly interested in Joseph's acceptance in the palace community of courtiers and servants. Was he merely being political in protecting or enhancing his new viceroy status as an influential advisor and administrator? Professor Levine suggests that Yosef, like other individuals on the spectrum, may have failed to grasp anything beyond a literal interpretation of Pharaoh's rhetorical or perhaps sarcastic question. Importantly, Sam stresses that Pharaoh's relationship is not based on finding a cure for ASD, but rather on fostering the habilitative journey of his royal appointee. Could Pharaoh even be viewed as what disability advocates call a natural support? Let me move to the story told in the house of Potiphar, which Sam talked about today, Potiphar being the chief slaughterer. It's well known, as Sam recounted, Potiphar's seductive wife, sometimes known as Zuleika, is trying to hit on a well-built and handsome Yosef, as one English translation puts it. She exclaims more than once, "Come to bed with me." She's attracted to him, but she also notes some childlike characteristics. Yosef refuses her continued ardent and amorous advances. Now, here's where my interpretation differs from Sam's. While his resistance is portrayed often as a triumph of morality or The disabled body has typically been viewed as passive, pathologized, victimized, and or unattractive. Disabled young men have reported on the barriers they face in negotiating sexual relationships, ranging from sociosexual isolation in adolescent years and parents' negative or protective attitudes to social expectations of normative functioning and poor body image. Together, these barriers affect not only the attainment of sexual intimacy, but also the representation of people with disabilities as asexual. Contemporary thinking has evolved. However, even a non-medicalized, rights-based approach to social and sexual expression tends to focus more on protection from unwanted encounters, following same-sex practices, and giving informed consent, more than it does on the capacity to be a publicly sexual and attractive being. Can we allow that an unself-conscious and disabled Joseph actually exuded sex appeal for a bored or unsatisfied housewife? Let me turn finally to the sibling relationships. Joseph's checkered history of brotherly relations, which you heard about today, stands in contrast to contemporary fraternal relationships in families that include a child with autism. Sam describes, quote, the feelings of isolation, marginalization, and bewilderment experienced by Joseph at the hands of his brothers and half-brothers. Contrast this with a recent study by education specialists, however, who found that siblings of adults with autism reported spending high quality time with their brother or sister in a variety of activities. In another study, more than half of those surveyed reported a close relationship with a sibling who has a severe intellectual or developmental disability. Let me say to conclude, the treatment of Joseph as someone on the autism spectrum helps illuminate the text of the Torah on a level of plain meaning, pshat, as well as the explanations found in Midrashim and other classic Jewish post-biblical sources. Situating Joseph in normalized, if exceptional settings, can also help the reader come to terms with the portrayal of a disability that many commentators have opposed as a catastrophe or a condition not fully human. God's invitation to inclusiveness applies to all peoples and embraces all their variations with regard to understanding causes, responses, and communities of those on or off the metaphoric spectrum.
Superb, thank you. Thank both of you so much, Sam and Steve. I just want to say thank you so much, Sam, for engaging in this effort, Steve, for working to bring Sam here to Berkeley, for sharing your ideas with us. What an honor, what a pleasure. Let's put our hands together and say thank you. We'll see you all soon. Take care.